Our guest today is Dmitry Orlov, who is the author of Reinventing Collapse, The Soviet Experience and American Prospects, also The 5 Stages of Collapse, The Survivor's Toolkit, and the new book he can later tell us about called Shrinking the Technosphere, Getting a Grip on the Technologies that Limit Our Autonomy, Self-Sufficiency, and Freedom. You can find his writings and work on his blog at dmitryorlov.blogspot.com. And thank you for joining us today, Dmitry.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start off with the first topic, the elections, but just the big picture, not the trivialities. What are your thoughts? And is the deep state still entrenched, or is a Trump win 2 steps back for the establishment? Or do you even think Trump is, part of the same establishment?
Oh, well, Trump is definitely part of the same establishment, but the establishment itself has basically run into an internal contradiction, a conflict. Inertia would carry it forward with a lot of failed policies, but there's also some recognition internally that these policies are a failure. And so a major shift is on the way, and in particular, there may be some internal challenges to neoliberalism and neoconservatism.
And what do you think Trump will continue that trajectory, or he's going to go some other way? What do you think is his platform or his ideology?
Well, if he can actually get the Republicans to cooperate, then he will have some scope of action. The problem is that the United States has worked itself very far into a corner and no longer has the resources to get out of it. So the scope of action will be limited by that.
And related, at least I feel nuclear war may have been averted for the time being, but I sense that Trump is a signal the time may soon be coming for an economic crash, as you've mentioned. Do you think he could be a sort of a scapegoat for the next Great Depression? Where do you see us in the global financial collapse that you and many others have been discussing for years?
Well, it doesn't seem probable that the United States will be able to continue with running up unrepayable debt at the same rate, at an ever-accelerating rate, actually, for the next 4 years. So, yes, some sort of major shift is going to have to happen.
I mean, you don't think QE, there could be another QE, or you think, you say they've painted themselves in the corner. You really don't see them pulling out any rabbit out of a hat this time?
I don't think that it's possible. The trends that have landed the U.S. in its current predicament have been more or less in place since the 1970s, with some postponements. The collapse of the USSR was basically a major postponement of the American collapse. But these are effects that are relatively short-lived on a historical timescale. And the systemic deficits that the United States has been running for decades now, that trend is very much entrenched, and I don't think Trump can do anything to break out of it. So we'll probably look at economic collapse of some sort and economic stagnation.
And I know you've written about it before. Has anything changed in your assessment? Could you paint just a little bit of a picture of what you think that transition or collapse might look like in the near term?
Well, it's the transition is dominated by the Chinese, and the Chinese don't do anything suddenly. They have this doctrine of small steps. They basically establish a trend line and then follow it for decades if necessary. But the overall trend line is to basically muscle the United States out of the international arena as much as possible, to get rid of the hegemony of the dollar, of the IMF, of the World Bank, of the Washington elite, just basically sideline them. And that process is ongoing. And I think under Trump, the United States will turn inward and try to lick its wounds rather than be an active player in the world. look for accommodation instead of conflict, and the process of sidelining it will accelerate.
And I've enjoyed as well as your commentaries on American society and culture in the past. And I don't know if your new book will deal with some of that, but what do you think this election says about American society, considering the quality of the candidates and the fact that Americans seem never to just break out of the box and go towards third party candidates? So how do you view American culture and society today?
Well, Trump is very much a non-party candidate. He's pretty much destroyed the Republican establishment in the process of seizing power, if you will, through the popular vote. The problem is that none of the establishment has any legitimacy or any popularity. They're just mired in ways of thinking that the rest of the country refuses to accept. So this vote for Trump was very much a rebellion.
Mhm. And the overall trajectory of American society as well. I mean, you see, when empires rise and when they decline, we see it at their peak, and in their decline, they seem to be. I mean, what's the excesses? They degenerate in a sense, and do you have that feeling as well?
Well, yes, it's a very divided place. If you look at for instance, if you look at the electoral map and you look at the concentrations of people who voted for Hillary Clinton, they're just giant blue circles on the map, and the biggest one is Chicago. But all the big cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, I believe, was there, San Francisco, huge blue circle. And so these are basically concentrations of people who are invested in the status quo, in the system. But then throughout the country, the red circles, they're all small, but there are many more of them. And those are all the people who have been disenfranchised by the system and want to crash it. And this election is part of the process of crashing the system.
And before getting your update on the new Cold War, I thought if you could tell us a bit about Russophobia, to introduce us to the Russian people and the Russian government. Because what I mean is that in the West, we are surrounded by some maniacal and frenzied people who just hate Russia and Russians. And what have Russia and their people been doing so wrong for the past 2 centuries to have everyone from Napoleon to Hitler to the West today hating on them? I mean, who is the average Russian, and how do they view the West and their people?
Well, it's the fact that what Russia does that's bad in the eyes of the West is that it exists, and it will never be forgiven for that grave mortal sin of simply existing. It's a huge place. It's a mosaic of nationalities. Ethnic Russians make up only about 2/3 of the population. Hundreds of languages, gigantic territory, all the natural resources a country could possibly want, and it's unique. It's a place that is too complex for the West to comprehend and digest, and impossible to control. It's a country that forges its own destiny. And that, in the eyes of the West, which tries to control the entire planet and set the agenda for all of humanity, is completely unacceptable. So it's sort of like the irresistible force meets the immovable object, Russia being the immovable object. And when Russia was weak and falling apart in the 90s, that was very much welcomed in the West. Yeltsin was considered a true Democrat, and all sorts of nonsense like that. But now that Russia is resurgent and once again asserts its own national interests at home and abroad, this development is being met with shock and horror in the West. The only way this could change is by a widespread recognition that the West, first of all, needs Russia, needs good relations with Russia. and can't survive without Russia. And secondly, that there is really nothing to be done about Russia except to reach accommodation with it.
Oh, I mean, we all just have to get along with each other. And what truly amazes me is just everyday people, though. We know how the power structure feels as you described it, but I'm here in Mexico, and I'm around foreigners and Mexicans, but I even get Mexicans that are hating, disliking Russians because of the media they consume from America, and it just boggles my mind. I'm like, why? um, but
Well, the media thing is really simple to explain. Media is all of the Western media pretty much is owned by a handful of large conglomerates controlled by very large private interests of a few oligarchs. Now, these oligarchs happen to personally hate Vladimir Putin because Putin did the unspeakable thing of putting the interests of his people before the interests of the oligarchs, and actually destroyed quite a few of them in various ways, or brought them to heel. And they will never forgive him for that, and they're his sworn enemies, and will do everything to denigrate him. So it's personal.
And he's fascinating character, Vladimir Putin. I read his thesis when I was in graduate school, and he seems to have carried out what he had written for his thesis to bring Russia back. And from your everyday experience, how do you feel that Americans and Europeans, how do they view Russia and Russians? From your personal experience, have you come across what's your feeling?
Well, there are all sorts of people. A lot of them simply don't really think. There's a lot about the schooling in Western countries and in the United States especially that basically teaches people to not think. And so what they do is they recite platitudes that they've heard before. And then the other thing is that they are very resistant to facts. They're fact-resistant humans, if you will, because their identity is bound up with belief in certain falsehoods. So if you destroy these falsehoods, you destroy them personally, and they take personal affront to that. So they have no choice but to continue to believe in a large set of lies about themselves and the world. And so a lot of them are just completely unreachable. As far as the Russian view of the West, well, they used to, and when the Soviet Union was falling apart, Russians aspired to becoming Europeans, basically. They wanted Russia to become a European country. And then more recent developments, well, basically how it went in the 90s, the plundering of Russia by a corrupt oligarchy that was pretty much aided and abetted by Western interests, told Russia's people that this path is not a path forward, and so they started to despise the experiments in democracy that were promoted by the West and by the United States. The stage-managed election of Yeltsin, for instance, and then later on the various affronts, the NATO encroachment, the bombing of Serbia, the involvements under false pretenses in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the destruction of Libya, now the destruction of Syria, have pretty much convinced the Russians that they basically they're facing not something that they should idolize, but in fact their enemy. If the United States and NATO, claw back some kind of normal state of relations with Russia, then that might change. But right now, the Russians are grimly aware of the fact that they may be forced to fight another war, just like with Napoleon and with Hitler.
And I can understand criticisms of the Russian government being corrupt. I mean, no government is perfect, and I would say there's corruption in every single government on the planet. And there's also the criticisms of the current Russian government being, somewhat authoritarian. But then I've read that this part of this Russian nationalist, Tsarist, and traditional view and history, which you kind of just mentioned that Russia wanted to go back to. And if we did the comparison, it can be argued that America has proportionately done as much bad or worse, if we look at the Soviet Union, but primarily to foreign populations and not its own domestic populations. How should one objectively view the current Russian government amidst all of these, insults and criticisms flying at them from the West?
Well, the first thing to understand from a non-Russian point of view is that the people holding that point of view aren't Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to put it not very politely, this is none of their business. The Russians will do whatever the Russians will do, and nobody can influence that or change it in any way at all without becoming, without creating animosity. If you're interested in whether the Russian government is good or acceptable as a negotiating partner, you can look at Russian elections, which were open and orderly, took place recently. You could look at the popularity of various Russian political figures and find out that they have much higher favorability ratings than politicians in the West. If you look at law and order, you can see how various crimes are prosecuted, whether corrupt officials are sent to jail or whether they're dismissed with a slap on the wrist, as they are in the United States often. That should all convince you that Russia is a well-governed and stable country.
And I did just want your comment or thought on the Moscow apartment bombings of 9/9, because it's something that my students and I examined this semester. We also looked at 9/11, and most of the students believe that 9/11 was some type of state operation. Do you have any comments on the Moscow apartment bombings?
I'm not aware of any evidence that this was perpetrated by state officials. On the other hand, in terms of 9/11, although I don't have any firsthand evidence, what is available leads me to believe that the official story is complete nonsense.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of science that talks about that. And then the new Cold War, where do you see us now with Trump saying he will talk to Russia, and Putin just announced, he came out, I guess, just today to comment on how he hopes to restore relations with the U.S. Do you see the same dangers of thermonuclear war still there? Where are we?
Nothing has really changed, except now, the momentum towards war will slow and hopefully reverse. This is not something that can be done in a day. The previous security framework was systematically destroyed by the U.S. and NATO. They broke every promise they made. They have recently made certain very aggressive gestures toward Russia. A lot of warmongering rhetoric has been used, and so this has created an atmosphere that is fraught with danger. What Trump has to do is basically negotiate a new security framework with Russia, and that will take time and a lot of effort. I'm sure that the Russians are willing to do it. The question is, can he do it?
And yesterday we interviewed analyst William Engdahl, and today I'm reading on Sputnik. Basically, they're repeating his thesis that it is clear that the American superpower status has diminished, and Mr. Engdahl thinks that there won't be war. Do you see anything greater coming out of? Do you see Syria dying down, or do you see the regional conflicts increasing?
Well, what's going on in Syria right now is this desperate effort to continue propping up the pet terrorists, West's pet terrorists in Aleppo, and that is the last desperate effort to keep the civil war from ending in favor of Bashar al-Assad, and what happens after that is the mop up in the desert, and that might that can take an arbitrarily long period of time, but it's the desert. There's nothing there. In the meantime, everywhere else, the war will have been over and will have been won by the Syrian people. So that's what I see happening in Syria. Basically, everything that the U.S. has tried there hasn't worked, backfired badly. And the strange thing is that the technique that the Americans have been trying in Syria and in various other places is what I call terrorism by proxy. So, the U.S. is the actual terrorist nation, terrorizing one country after another, but they don't do it themselves. They let their pet terrorists, whom they arm and train, do the dirty work. And the problem is that by proxy has never worked. It always backfires. It always fails. And the Americans are just refusing to learn the lesson.
I was joking that now that Hillary's not going to be in power and she won't be able to fund ISIS, I guess ISIS will have to go gamble at a Trump casino. I don't know, to get some more funds. But
well, they will still get funds from Saudi Arabia.
Are there any other global issues aside from potential thermonuclear war with Russia or the global economic collapse that you think about or you think that we should be aware of?
Well, there's a kind of a trade war brewing because Russia has banned all genetically modified organisms. And this is a major affront to the lobbyists, the Monsanto, and others, and Cargill and others who have excelled at regulatory capture in the United States and basically have had, legislation passed that they themselves wrote. The fact that one of the largest food producers in the world has now banned all of their products is a major affront to them, and we'll have to see how it shakes out. But basically, you can't really ban GMOs in just one country. You have to ban them everywhere in the world. And so, if Russia succeeds, genetically modified agriculture will be over everywhere.
And I do. It seems China has been experimenting and researching, and seeming to want to implement GMO in some parts of China. And I know here in Mexico they banned GMO corn, but I know a number of people who work in the business, and Monsanto is still present here in Mexico, and there is still GMO corn around. And it seems like once you have GMO, the seeds kind of spread. I mean, is there a way to eliminate the GMO?
Actually, it's the opposite. All GMO seeds are non-viable. They produce plants that do not reproduce, and they're broken in that way. They're damaged on purpose. And so, what GMO does is destroy heirloom varieties by GMO pollen spreading and contaminating non-GMO plots. And when heirloom varieties are destroyed in this manner, that is an immediate threat to food security, because with climate change and rapidly shifting climates, it's the heirloom varieties that stand the best chance of surviving, whereas the GMO hybrids all fail at the same time. When there's a good harvest, they provide superior yields, but when they fail, they all fail completely.
And they also should be considered dangerous because they do form part of a national security military system. No, it can be used as a weapon, GMOs, against other countries, and that's, I think, one reason why Russia prohibited it. No.
Yes, absolutely. It's a way to make one's food dependent on a single source. The Russians had a very bad experience with importing wheat from the U.S. and Canada under terms that became progressively more onerous as the Cold War wore on, and that was one of the reasons the Soviet Union fell apart.
Any final thoughts or musings to young folks and people out there living on a world on the brink of everything from nuclear war to GMO zombie apocalypse or financial crash? And any final thoughts? I guess people can read your books. What are some things people can do?
to say to young people, of course, I want them to read my books, but what I want to really tell them is that the world in which they will be living will be almost unrecognizable based on what their experience been so far, what their parents' experience been, and the last few generations, basically, second half of the 20th century, will look like an anomaly from their point of view, and that they should really be looking out for people who are the closest to them, because the world is going to become unrecognizable.
And can you tell us about your latest book and how people can best support you and your work?
Oh, well, buying my book, my book, which is coming out this month, is a good way of supporting me. It's called Shrinking the Technosphere, and it talks about how technology has become a sentient entity that controls humans as opposed to the other way around, and what we have to do to wrest control back from it.
Okay, well, I look forward to picking that up, as well as reading it and perhaps in the future discussing it with you. Thank you, Dmitry, for your time and all of your work and your blogging and your effort.
Thank you very much.